Our scripture lesson for today comes from 2 Timothy, the first chapter, the 3rd through the 7th verse. And this is what it says. I am grateful to God, whom I worship with a clear conscience, as my ancestors did, when I remember you constantly in my prayers night and day. Recalling your tears, I long to see you so that I may be filled with joy. I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that lived first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I'm sure lives in you. For this reason, I remind you to rekindle the gift of God that is within you through the laying on of my hands. For God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, but rather a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline. You know, it's Black History Month, and there's a lot going on. You see a lot of different things on TV and, different things going on in the communities. But I didn't want to focus this sermon. I wanted to acknowledge Black History Month, the shortest month of the year, but I didn't want to go through that list of Black firsts. I didn't want to go through a list of Black creations or a list of Black leaders. There are certain people whose names are called frequently during Black History Month. I didn't want to do any of that. But this week, I was struck by an article in Time magazine that spoke about the Black history that we lost in the past 2 years that we've been living through COVID-19. Too many people unexpectedly got sick, too sick to share their stories, who died too quickly to write down the recipes that were handed down from their ancestors, recipes that will never be cooked again, family origins that will never be known, those trips back to where the family lived and up the country, as they say, those trips are not going to happen anymore. In the Time article, they highlighted a woman who was a midwife who succumbed to COVID-19. And along with her went all of the wisdom and the knowledge that now she won't be able to transition to new generations of midwives. So much cumulative history lost in just the last 2 years. You know, as of Friday, the count of COVID-19 deaths just in this country was 942,301. And then I read in another CDC report that indicated that 34% of COVID deaths in this country were non-Hispanic Black people, which equates to over 320,000 people whose stories, whose contribution to Black history ended before it could be secured. Legacies that will only live on if they were captured in writing or recorded or witnessed by someone who cares enough to remember. Not just remember a list of events, but to remember the reasons, the richness, and the meaning and the lessons to be gained. I'm reminded of a story that Alice Walker wrote. It's a short story called Everyday Youth, in which there are 2 sisters and their mother. One sister was very much a homebody. She was described as very plain, nothing remarkable about her. They described her as chin on the chest, eyes to the ground. And then she had her sister D, and it said for D, no was a word that the world never said to her. And hesitation was not part of her nature. She had gone off to school and had stayed away from her home until this one day she came back. And she had become very contemporary and very rooted in Black culture, to the point that she changed her name to detach herself, that she said was given to her by her oppressors. But in the process, she also detached herself from the name that was passed down from her grandmother and from her aunt, and probably through generations of her ancestors. She came back home, though, asking for art objects that had been used by her family for years, used for survival and used for everyday use. But at this point in her life, for Dee, those objects, even the quilt that was hand-stitched by her grandmother, those were to her just display pieces to use for her own decorations and no ongoing depth of meaning or use. It reminded me of how we can get detached from our history, which actually blocks some of the richness of our own legacy. That brings us to the text that was read out of 2 Timothy. In the text, the Apostle Paul, or some people say someone writing in the name of Paul, penned these words. If it was Paul, it's believed he wrote the words while he was in prison awaiting his death. And these words were to have been written to Timothy, who was supposed to carry on the work of spreading the love-based gospel of Jesus in places where that was a countercultural message. So to encourage Timothy, Paul appeals to a legacy of faith that had been passed down from his grandmother to his mother and now was in him. This was a significant thing to do because his mother and his grandmother's faith was different than his own. Whereas their faith was more of a traditional law-based Judaism, Timothy's faith was more of a love-based message of Jesus. Paul was saying that even Timothy's current faith was born out of the same foundation and the same experience that had been with the Jews for generations, that had brought them out of bondage and had guided them and kept them through various captivities and deliverances. Paul was saying that the root of that faith, the power of that kind of faith, was in Timothy as well. That's why he said, I'm reminded of your sincere faith, the faith that lived first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I'm sure lives in you. It's similar to how my mother was a very faithful, compassionate African Methodist Episcopal Christian who was born to a very faithful traditional Baptist mother. And here I am, a progressive, contemporary, very liberal, trans-religious follower of the way of Jesus who is not confined by tradition or doctrine. But I am old and wise enough to know that power and that presence of the divine that is in me today started in me at Bethel AME Church 60 years ago. Paul needed to remind Timothy of the powerful essence of the divine that was already in him. And that would empower him to do the work of love and of justice in his time, as it did for his ancestors. The power of the divine was not just in the past, it was right where Timothy was. That power was very present as his present day legacy. I read in Psychology Today where Dr. William Breitbart said, legacy, in fact, plays the most vital of roles as the medium by which we transmit vital information, values, tradition, and wisdom to the next generation. Legacy is, in fact, spiritual and cultural DNA. We all inherit legacies of profound influence in our lives. Well, unfortunately, for some of us, that legacy shows us how not to live. We often speak of legacy in the context of what we've inherited or what we will give to the next generation. But between that past and the future, we're right here, living as legacies in progress. In the text, that's why after connecting Timothy to the power of his past, the author reminded Timothy, for this reason, I remind you to rekindle the gift of God that is within you through the laying on of my hands. For God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, but rather a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline. That legacy was living and moving in Timothy. Because legacy is an ever-evolving continuum. For those of us who are Black, we are creating Black history with every decision, with every action, with every word. We are living our legacy every day. It's not a static gift from those who have gone before. It is active. So even if what you received was less than desirable, maybe a history of alcoholism, a history of argumentative relationships or violence, a history of narcissism or low self-esteem, or a loveless history. This is your time now. You are living this legacy. It may take some work, but we have the power to do something different. Barack Obama quoted someone. He said, someone once said that every man is trying to live up to his father's expectation or make up for their father's mistakes. The power of change is in all of us, no matter what our age. Because as the scripture said, God did not give us a spirit of cowardice or fear, but rather a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline. I like kind of how I learned it, which was God gave us a spirit of power and love and a sound mind. One day, somebody's going to be looking back and writing, how did Black people handle and come out of the COVID-19 pandemic? What did that era of Black history look like? Did we operate from a position of power and love and a sound mind? Did we care for each other? Did we learn that life is precious as well as fleeting? What did people of all races and all nationalities learn? Did we learn that what impacts one impacts all? So that what's happening today in Ukraine impacts us all, not just because gas prices go up, but because people's lives and people's ways of life are at stake. There's such an attack on democracy here and around the world. We have a call to action that even our individual input, no matter how small it seems, is critical at this time. It could be as much as calling a senator or casting a vote. But whatever it is, let our actions be something that we could be proud of and proud to be called our legacy. I read a quote that said, create the world you want to pass on to your children. Let's let the stories of our lives have meaning. Pass on to our children the stories we've learned from our elders and write down our own story. The story we're crafting right now is a continuation of a story of someone who survived a slave ship or escaped some form of political or religious oppression. Some of the physical objects we own, like that blanket and those household items in Alice Walker's story, are things to be honored for the stories that they still embody. Kind of like the ceramic teapot with the man and the cactus on the front of it that sits on the shelf in my house. It sits in our family room, but it once held money that we would use as children at my grandmother's house. When the good humor man or Mr. Softy passed by, we would run a quarter mile up that gravel road and try to get there in time to get our ice cream. That's after convincing my grandmother to give us the money. Or stories like what my mother wrote down that I read recently that let me know that when she was born and through some of her childhood, She, her brother, and my grandparents lived in a converted chicken coop on Jim Clement's farm where my grandfather worked. That story fills me with gratitude and appreciation for the 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath home I have right now and the work it took to earn it. And I passed that story, those stories down to my daughter so she knows that her relatives were people who made the best out of humble beginnings. And now she can hold in her hands in 2022 the cookie jar that was part of that household. That is now part of her legacy. I've read somewhere legacy is a lesson in the value of survivalship. We live our legacy every day. Remember and bless our past, and then face our future with hope, but always with power, love, and a sound mind, no matter what's going on. And I would add to that with appreciation and honor and an openness to the awe of life. I want to close this message with a poem I read by Nikki Giovanni, and it's called On My Journey Now. And it says, there is this special feeling you get when you snuggle under a quilt that was made by your great-grandmother, washed and cared for by your mother, passed on to you soft, clean, and sweet smelling from the days before washing machines did wash and dry cleaners did pressing. There's a special feeling you get when you remember the smell of fat meat boiling in the pot, waiting for the greens to come and to share a smaller space. There's a feeling you get when you look back at the beauty and wonder of our people that sends apple boiling smells to tickle your nose and lets you know, yes, this is not my home, only my stop on the journey. And one day, you know, you'll make the next step to that glorious plane. Thank you for listening.